If you've looked at the map of Middle-earth, you've probably seen the big name at the very top, Forodwaith. It's one of the few places in Middle-earth where we never get a first-hand perspective, one of the few places where we're not sure if any of the characters that we know have ever been there. So, what's the deal with Forodwaith? What does it look like? Who lives there? And how did it become the way that it is in the Third Age? The history of Forodwaith goes back to before the First Age. When Morgoth first returned to Arda, he needed a base of operations, and he chose the north of Middle-earth, the land that would eventually be known as Forodwaith. There, he raised the massive mountain chain known as the Iron Mountains, and beneath those mountains he delved his first fortress of Autumno, and further to the west, the fortress of Angband. As Morgoth's primary powers were that of heat and cold, he turned these lands into a frozen hellscape, rendering them unnaturally cold, even into the Fourth Age. From his base in the north, Morgoth would unleash unimaginable horrors upon the world, blighting the spring of Arda and tainting the world, destroying the two lamps which completely reshaped Middle-earth, and forcing the Valar to withdraw, and finally, upon the awakening of the elves, it was from Autumno where Morgoth would harass them, possibly turning some of them into the first orcs. Eventually, the Valar responded, Morgoth's forces were defeated, Autumno was destroyed, and Morgoth was taken captive. But notably, the fortress of Angband survived mostly intact, and from there, Sauron, Morgoth's lieutenant, slowly rebuilt the strength of his master. And when Morgoth escaped his captivity in Valinor, it was to Angband he returned. With the exception of the Feanorians, most of the Noldor followed him across the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice, a side effect of the frosts of Morgoth. It's described as such: vast fogs and mists of deathly cold, and the sea streams were filled with clashing hills of ice and the grinding of ice deep sunken. Thus, many of the Noldor perished during the march, including Elenwe, the Vanya wife of the future High King Turgon. If that was not enough to prove the usefulness of Morgoth's freezing of the northern lands, then the later Siege of Angband would. Following Morgoth's disastrous invasion of Beleriand, the Dagor Aglareb, the Glorious Battle, the Noldor decided to set up a siege of Angband, but owing to the impassability of the Iron Mountains and the brutal cold of the lands behind it, the siege was never truly completed. As a result, Morgoth rebuilt his strength in the Dor Daedaloth, the land of the Shadow of Horror, and from the icy wastes, Morgoth could send forces around the siege to harass the peoples of Middle-earth. Eventually, the Noldor did manage to gain some insight into what was going on in the frozen north, and that was thanks to the arrival of men, who awoke with the first coming of the sun. In particular, the Hedorians were well adapted to dealing with the freezing cold, and their scouts were able to venture north and keep an eye on the movements of Morgoth's forces. And surprisingly, men didn't just venture into the frozen north as scouts. Some men also lived there, presumably further to the east. These are the mysterious men known as the Forodwaith, the people of the north. I did a whole Middle-earth Mysteries video about them. Thus, the name Forodwaith refers to both a place and a people. But like I said, next to nothing is known about the Forodwaith. We do know a little about their descendants, the Lossoth, but more on them soon. Another interesting little fact: in the earliest versions of Tolkien's Legendarium, concerning the Anglo-Saxon sailor Elfwine, the Forodwaith refer to the Vikings. Unfortunately for the Noldor and the Edain, their inability to fully encircle Angband meant that Morgoth could recover his strength, and the siege of Angband was broken. Over the next 80 years, Morgoth would systematically destroy his enemies, or in a few cases, his enemies would destroy themselves. But just as his domination over Beleriand was complete, the legendary Earendel managed to sail to Valinor and begged the pardon of the Valar. This led to the War of Wrath, in which Morgoth was defeated again, and most of Beleriand perished beneath the waves. The cataclysm that destroyed Beleriand did not spare Forodwaith. The Iron Mountains seem to have been completely torn down in the aftermath, and Morgoth's realm of Dor Daedaloth was completely destroyed. As a result, a huge chunk of Forodwaith also perished beneath the waves, leaving the massive Ice Bay of Forakel behind. You can see a small section of the Ice Bay on the standard maps of Middle-earth, but in actuality, the Ice Bay extended much further north, and was enclosed on the northern side by the massive Cape of Forakel. When Morgoth was defeated, many of his surviving servants also fled into the icy wastes. Some would remain there, while others would flee into the east. Until Sauron started gathering evil to him in Mordor, it was from Forodwaith where the greatest threat to Middle-earth would remain: orcs, trolls, and the powerful dragons. Even during the early Second Age, the lands of the dwarves and the Northmen were being attacked by Morgoth's surviving servants. Although these early attacks were repelled, after Sauron weaponized these servants following the War of the Elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age, places like Gundabad were lost to the Orcs, the Grey Mountains became infested, and the Misty Mountains became a battleground. This infestation of orcs and trolls would prove to be a thorn in the side of the Free Peoples even into the Fourth Age. But the deadliest of these foes were the dragons. Being some of the most powerful of Morgoth's servants, the dragons had rejected Sauron's call and remained in the frozen north. There they continued to breed, some even spreading into the Withered Heath, the valley between the two arms of the Grey Mountains. They made their presence felt the most during the War of the Dwarves and Dragons in the late Third Age, forcing the dwarves to abandon the Grey Mountains. Following that, Smaug, who was probably born in the Frozen Wastes, would descend upon Erebor and take it for himself. Durin's folk were not the only dwarves to face the dragons. The dwarves of the east were not spared, meaning some dragons evidently used the Frozen Wastes of Forodwaith to pass into the east of Middle-earth. And if Morgoth's servants weren't bad enough, then there was the legacy of Morgoth's frost. Keep in mind, Forodwaith was not at an Arctic latitude, and was unnaturally cold thanks to Morgoth's power. This unnatural cold would spread into neighbouring lands, meaning that lands like Eriador, and even lands as far south as Rohan, could sometimes have extreme winters that lasted nearly half the year. It was possible that the Witch King used this cold to his advantage during his occupation of Angmar, as eastern Eriador became colder during that time, and the Ice Bay of Forakel was often hit by powerful storms. Yet despite all of the bad that was associated with Forodwaith, men still lived there, namely the aforementioned Lossoth, a remnant of the ancient people known as the Forodwaith. Some of their settlements could be found on the southern shore of Forakel. They were an aloof and superstitious people, and while they were afraid of outsiders, they were not hostile and could even be quite helpful, as proven by their care of King Arvedui of Arthedain. They were adept at living in the cold climate. They were hunters who used skates and sleds, and had learned how to build ice houses, probably the equivalent of igloos. But, as I talk about in my Middle-earth Mysteries video on the Forodwaith, they probably had an unhappy history. The Lossoth are described as a remnant of the Forodwaith, and were now mostly confined to living around the Bay of Forakel, implying that most of that ancient people had been wiped out by Morgoth's servants, the Frost, or even the cataclysm that followed Morgoth's defeat. But maybe being dead is better than living in such a forsaken place. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting, and if you didn't know anything about Forodwaith, I hope you learned a thing or two. I know Amazon's Rings of Power is a controversial topic, but I actually really liked the portrayal of Forodwaith at the beginning of that show. If you want to experience a part of Forodwaith, you can explore Forakel in the Lord of the Rings Online, a beautiful zone, although a little annoying to get around. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if not for the jet stream, Europe might be a northern waste too. Or maybe not, I don't really understand atmospheric science.